Welcome to the International Wildlife Coalition session at the Animal Legal Defense Fund's virtual Animal Law Symposium. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nick Fromhurst. I'm an adjunct professor and the Latin American program director at the Global Law Alliance for Animals and the Environment at Lewis and Clark Law School. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Tanya Sanerub is the International Legal Director at the Center for Biological Diversity, where she advocates for wildlife using a unique brand of international advocacy that combines innovative domestic litigation with more traditional international policy work. She also advocates for wildlife at CITES and other international fora in an effort to stem the ongoing extinction crisis and protect species for future generations. Zack Smith is a senior attorney and director of international wildlife conservation at the National Resources Defense Council. His work focuses on protecting some of our most iconic species from the numerous threats that endanger their health and drive them toward extinction. His work preserving wild animals and wild spaces involves environmental and sustainability issues, including climate change, resource conservation, and ocean pollution. Finally, Dr. Rajesh Reddy is the Animal Law Program Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, where he leads the Global Animal Law Program and the International Animal Law LLM Program, the world's first and only advanced legal degree program for animal law. Outside of Lewis and Clark, he chairs the International Subcommittee of the Animal Law Section of the American Bar Association and serves as a board member for Minding Animals International. Thank you all for joining us today. We will begin with a presentation from Tanya.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this panel on international wildlife coalitions. Before we shift our focus internationally, I wanted to touch on a few ways that international advocacy deviates from our domestic work. I feel really fortunate because I get to operate in both spheres. I engage internationally for wildlife, but I also do a lot of work here in the United States using the amazing wildlife tools that we have at our disposal to try to get protections for foreign wildlife. So I just wanted to touch on three main points of divergence that I've certainly recognized between domestic and international advocacy. So the first one is typically internationally, civil society doesn't get a vote. A lot of multilateral environmental agreements are generally agreements between countries. And they're the ones who get the opportunity to call the shots. Sometimes civil society, NGOs, we don't even get to voice our views before a vote happens. One of the other key parts of international advocacy work is we don't have legal recourses. I know a lot of us domestically are accustomed to availing ourselves of the court system, whether it's federal or state. We're able to get into court and review government decisions if they're unlawful, if they're arbitrary. A lot of us engage in administrative processes trying to help federal agencies make the best decisions possible. And in the United States, we have the right to petition our government when we see actions that need to be taken. Generally speaking, those tools are not available to us internationally. So that greatly hampers our efforts. And the other key part is information. Again, in the United States domestically, we frequently rely on federal open government laws, the Freedom of Information Act at the state level, the state public record acts. They're all key for the work that we do, and they get us great information. And while there's a handful of countries around the world that have similar laws, they're not always accessible to foreign citizens. And the lack of information, the data gaps are definitely things that hamper our work internationally. And I raise all of these issues just to make the point that that means when it comes to international advocacy, collaboration is really key. Being able to pool our resources, band organizations together, that's a really, really crucial way to get work done. So I've been asked to talk specifically about the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, CITES. And I'm specifically going to talk about elephants because CITES is responsible for the commercial ivory trade ban. And it's been a really key agreement for conservation of elephants, but lots of other species. So we'll focus on elephants today. One of the key things about CITES to keep in mind is it protects species that are either threatened with extinction or may soon become so, that are or may be affected by trade. It's in some ways a little bit like the United States Endangered Species Act, and that species get listed. But for CITES, it depends on the appendix that the species is placed on. That sort of dictates the protections that the species gets. So Appendix 1 has a commercial trade ban for a species and for specimens from a species. And specimens is a unique term of art for CITES. Basically, it just means any of the parts or the products from the animal. So when you think of an elephant, that's everything from an ivory tusk to a trophy made out of an elephant foot, to blood samples. All of that falls within that broad definition of specimens. Now, Asian elephants were placed on Appendix 1 back in 1973 when the agreement was first reached. African elephants joined them in 1989. And then we had some stepping back. In 1997 and 2000, 4 countries, first Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe, were downlisted to Appendix 2, and then South Africa followed. Again, Appendix 2 is for those species that may soon be threatened with extinction. Now, typically for species that are placed on Appendix 2, there's 3 major requirements that have to be met for trade to happen. So the exporting country has to find that the export is not going to be detrimental to the survival of the species. They have to find that the animal or the specimen was legally acquired, and they need to ensure if it's a live animal that'll be prepared and shipped to minimize the risk of injury, damage to health, or cruel treatment. The elephant populations, however, on Appendix 2, fortunately, have what's called a specific annotation that restricts trade even further. Because you can imagine looking at this array of trade protections, thinking about the ivory trade, this wouldn't do a whole lot to protect elephants. So we're very fortunate that the elephants on Appendix 2 do have this annotation that further restricts trade. But nonetheless, it's not the same as having all of elephants listed on Appendix 1 and being subject to a commercial trade ban. And so a common campaign at CITES is to uplist all elephants to get them the same protections. This is done through a lot of public advocacy. There's a lot of campaigns to talk about the fact that ivory belongs to elephants, that we need to end poaching, that we shouldn't be supporting markets that sell ivory. It's also been done through science. Back in 2016, we had the Great Elephant Census that unfortunately demonstrated really major declines in elephant populations. And while we have all these different strategies for trying to put pressure on governments globally, at the end of the day, it's their call whether or not to uplist elephants to Appendix 1. Fortunately, though, listings aren't the only action at CITES. It's not the only way to get protections for species. The parties also adopt what are called resolutions. These interpret the convention text, they give it meaning. They also adopt decisions, which can guide the work of the parties, the CITES Secretariat, the intersessional bodies. So those are all really important tools also for getting protections for wildlife. One big step for elephants back in 2016 was an agreement between the United States and China to close their domestic ivory markets. So we have this international trade ban from CITES, and then it's up to countries around the world to decide what to do with species at the domestic level. And so we have this agreement between 2 major ivory markets to close their domestic ivory markets, and it resulted in a global sea change. We ended up having language as part of a resolution adopted at CITES calling on all parties, that's countries all around the world, to close their legal commercial ivory markets that can either contribute to poaching or illegal trade. And that was a big game changer for elephants. So not only do we have the US and China with the original agreement, but Hong Kong, Singapore, Israel, the UK, all closed their domestic ivory markets. Right now we have the EU, New Zealand, and Australia all in the process of adopting final measures to put domestic market closures in effect. It's been a really big campaign. It's been incredibly beneficial. We're seeing some signs that we might actually see decreases in elephant poaching. But there's one major market that still hasn't closed, and there's a lot of work still to be done to try to get Japan to close their domestic ivory markets. Now, a lot of what I've been talking about so far has really sort of talked about how NGOs, both conservation and animal welfare organizations have worked together in lockstep to really try to accomplish things internationally at CITES for wildlife. I don't want to paint too rosy of a picture and make it sound like we always agree on everything, because that is certainly, unfortunately, not always the case. And that has really come about through the COVID-19 pandemic and what the response should be to that, and the role, if any, that CITES should play in pandemic prevention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think a lot of us are really aware that wildlife and nature are where we're most likely to encounter novel pathogens. As human populations continue to grow, as more and more people enter into pristine ecosystems, exploit, farm, and trade more and more wildlife, all while our climate is changing, we're increasingly encountering novel pathogens. And what's been sort of termed here by the scientific experts as the era of pandemics. Basically, we can expect more novel pathogens and expect them to emerge more frequently. The UN Secretary General has called this our suicidal war on nature, and finding ways to change that is going to be key to preventing future pandemics. So one of the key questions that's arisen for people who address wildlife trade is, how do we go about this? How do we address the next pandemic? And when you look at a lot of the science, even the science on the One Health approach, a lot of it is really focused on disease reemergence. So monitoring, surveillance of domestic animals, testing for known pathogens. Those of you who work on factory farming are all too familiar with these issues. But a lot of that science, and in particular, the policy recommendations that come out of those scientific papers, don't address the emergence of novel pathogens. Those who work on wildlife trade quickly realized that surveillance and monitoring works for the known, but it doesn't work for the unknown, right? You can't test for something that you don't know. So we need some different solutions. And that's where we had this major disagreement at what should happen in the CITES context. So there's those who suggested actually amending CITES, opening up the convention text and adding another appendix, one which would list risky species, so those that we decide globally not to trade in. And then there was a counter suggestion, and that was the idea to take the CITES framework, use it as a guide, but flip it. The idea being to halt all trade unless it's proven safe. So this would effectively curtail trade in a large number of taxa, probably predominantly birds and mammals. And it would be done through a sister agreement, or what's called a protocol. It'd be separate from CITES. It would leave the convention to carry out its mandate and then create a different sort of space, a different sandbox, so to speak, for engagement. So at the core of the debate at CITES are really two primary issues. The first key consideration is what mechanism would or could be able to most rapidly respond to the threat. The scientists have said that we have a decade and we can expect another COVID-like pandemic. As we all know, lawmaking takes a lot of time, especially when negotiating new international agreements. So one of the key considerations is, how can we most quickly get to action? And is that through a new agreement or modifying an existing agreement? One of the other key considerations is really down in the nitty-gritty about regulation. What's the best solution? What's the best policy going forward? Do we want a blacklist of species that we've decided are too risky for us to trade in? Or are we better off with a whitelist approach where we say nothing gets traded until it can be proven safe? Or is there another middle ground? Could we look at the whole of supply chain and make calls on if it's a single species, if it's a short supply chain, if there's testing, would that somehow be able to be safe? It's a lot of considerations, definitely. There's way more to the debate than just these two things, but I wanted to highlight these two primary mechanisms that have been debated at CITES, and I think we'll definitely hear a lot more about. Thankfully, the discussions at CITES have in some ways been superseded by great progress that's been made at WHO, the World Health Organization. And we've seen international agreement there to negotiate a pandemic treaty. And I think there have been discussions specifically in that context about what to do about wildlife and whether a separate protocol is needed. So we may see some of these ideas reemerge in those negotiations. But I will say for CITES' part, there's definitely been a recognition of the need for CITES to collaborate with other bodies like OIE, like WHO. CITES is going to collect information from the parties to the agreement. And it's also going to encourage that CITES focal points to engage and ensure their expertise with wildlife is brought to bear internationally. That's a lot of information, but I have one final point that I really wanted to highlight. Whether you engage in international advocacy for wildlife or not, one thing that's really crucial to recognize is just how significant the US market is for wildlife trade. When we hear of wildlife trade, a lot of us think of elephant ivory, we think of tigers and rhino horn, we think of demand for wildlife that happens in other regions of the world. But what most people don't realize is that the United States is a major consumer market. We're typically in the top 4 globally. We're estimated to take up at least 20% of the global wildlife trade. A 2017 study estimated that we import roughly 225 million live animals, 883 million specimens a year. And when I say wildlife trade in the US, I'm talking about everything from pets, food, fashion, decor, trophies, medicine. Those are all the forms of wildlife that flood our borders into the United States, especially in the midst of an extinction crisis. We play a major role. Educating the US public about that and what they buy and its consequences is really, really key. So even if you don't engage in international advocacy, you can absolutely help foreign wildlife by encouraging consumers to think about what they're buying. Our wildlife friends will thank you for that. And I thank you for letting me speak today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Zack Smith. I am a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I direct our global biodiversity conservation work. I want to talk today about wildlife advocacy within that context of global conservation, and specifically through the lens of what's taking place at the Convention on Biological Diversity. So I have a slideshow to go over today, and I wanted to share it with you. And I think a good place to start in all of this is understanding where we're at, setting the stage, so to speak. And of course, we are in the midst of 2 existential crises, the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And there are 2 sides to this, the impacts to wildlife and ecosystems, and then what that means for humans. So how is it impacting wildlife? Well, it's really not good. As you have probably heard in the global assessment report that came out in 2019, that found that there are 1 million plant and animal species threatened with extinction, many within decades. And this is more than ever before in human history. I like to think of these species as 1 million canaries in our global coal mine. It's 1 million species warning us that we are on the wrong path. And it makes me think about what signal are we getting if we have a planet that cannot support 1/8 of its wildlife? What does that say about its ability to support human life? And of course, this isn't just an issue about stopping the bad activities that are currently taking place, although that's obviously where we need to start. It's also an issue of restoration, because of these species, more than 500,000 of the terrestrial plant and animal species, they have insufficient habitat for long-term survival without restoration. So we must not just stop the drivers of nature's decline, we must actually work to repair nature if we want to save these 500,000 dead species walking. Of course, that's an awful situation for wildlife, but it's also an awful situation for human survival. Nature's contribution to people is the bedrock of our basic life necessities, like food and clean water. And as Dr. Bob Watson, the former chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that's a mouthful, said, biodiversity and thriving ecosystems are at the heart of our survival. And if we don't halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, we risk not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. And that was, of course, borne out in the most recent IPCC report that warned that Earth is firmly on track toward an unlivable world. People are going to suffer, and people are already suffering. We depend on high-functioning, thriving, and abundant with wildlife ecosystems to produce the critical foundations of human life and society, like clean air, clean water, food security, crop pollination, and flood control. Land degradation has already reduced crop productivity, and we risk more than $500 billion in annual global crops from pollinator loss. More than 500 million people face food insecurity, and hundreds of millions of people are at increased risk of floods and hurricanes because of the loss of coastal habitat and their protections. 40% of the global population lacks access to clean and safe drinking water, while industrial facilities dump 300 to 400 million tons of heavy metals, solvents, toxic sludge, and other waste into the world's waters every year. Altogether, 1 in 5 countries are at risk of their ecosystems collapsing because of declines in biodiversity and other natural services. And these were the figures, these statistics were from 2019. And of course, it's only gotten worse. The trends have not improved at all. So what is driving this? Well, of course, our economic system has completely destroyed or otherwise seriously degraded vast swaths of the natural world, rendering them unable to provide the ecosystem services we need. And the direct drivers of nature's decline were identified in the IPBES report from 2019. And they are listed in here on the slide in the order of importance, or the order of impact, I should say. And of course, the number 1 is changes in land and sea use. The second is direct exploitation of organisms. And that direct exploitation of organisms is actually number 1 for marine ecosystems. And so the top 2 get switched out depending if we're talking about terrestrial or marine ecosystems. And of course, the third is climate change, then pollution, and then invasive alien species. And I would note that climate change over time will overtake all of these. It will become the dominant driver over the next decades. And how does this manifest itself as to what we're seeing? Obviously, the million species that are threatened with extinction is a symptom, but what's happening on the ground, so to speak? Well, we've already altered 75% of the terrestrial environment by human actions, and that's severely altered. And more than 85% of wetlands that were present in 1700 were lost by the year 2000. Of course, more than 55% of the world's ocean areas are subject to industrial fishing, with 1/3 of marine fish stocks over-harvested and 60% harvested at the edge of sustainability. Coastal areas, as I noted before, at increased risk of floods and hurricanes due to loss of coastal habitat protection. Many natural systems are near the hard limits of their ability to adapt. And this we learned from the latest IPCC report that came out earlier this year, Climate Change 2022, Impacts Adaptation and Vulnerability. And the story that this report told in kind of another way of looking at it than from the IPBES report that talked about the global assessment of biodiversity was talking about the ability of these ecosystems to be resilient in the face of climate change and to adapt. And as noted, that many natural systems are near the hard limits of their ability to adapt, and ecosystems already reaching or surpassing hard adaptation limits include some warm water coral reefs, some coastal wetlands, some rainforests, and some polar and mountain ecosystems. So that's the bad news of kind of where we're at. But what can we do? And what is the international community doing to respond? Well, we do have the Convention on Biological Diversity that was entered into force in December of 1993. It has 3 main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. All members of the United Nations are parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity except for two, the Holy See and the United States, which frankly, and we can talk about this during the Q&A, I don't really see the United States not being a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity as a particular problem. Now, in the year 2010, the Convention on Biological Diversity set targets and goals for conservation for the decade 2010 to 2020. These were known as the Aichi biodiversity targets. And they dealt with everything with respect to like how much land should we protect, what should we be doing for invasive species, several different targets associated with the different kinds of aspects of conservation that come up. Unfortunately, the progress on all of these targets has not been very good. As you can see here, the red is where no progress was made, yellow is some progress, and then green represented substantial progress. At the end of the day, when we reached 2020 and assessed where we were with the Aichi biodiversity targets, the conclusion was that none of them were fully met. I think it begs the question of why not? Why, and what can we do in response when we set the next 10 years of targets, which are currently being negotiated? What should we be doing? And again, we can turn to the science for an answer there. And it turns out that we need transformative change. And it's only through scenarios that included transformative change were we able to reverse the declines in nature. But what do we mean by transformative change? Well, the scientists were very explicit that that means a fundamental system-wide reorganization across economic, political, technological, and social factors, including paradigm shifts around goals and values. So that seems like a big lift, and it is, because by its very nature, transformative change threatens business as usual and the people who profit off of business as usual and the systems that are in place to maintain business as usual. So, and that's clear because the kind of transformative change is things like degrowth and capping resource use, reducing consumption in rich countries, and actually championing alternatives to capitalism. And so when we think about that, we need to shift the current limited paradigm of economic growth towards an approach to nature, an approach to an economic system that puts other values forward first. One such example of this is the half Earth concept, where we should prioritize biodiversity for half the planet. And this was outlined by E.O. Wilson, who is known by some as the father of biodiversity, but also by scientists who are currently working through things like the Global Deal for Nature, which was very clear that we cannot reverse declines in nature without protecting more areas. And of course, we can't limit global warming without natural climate solutions. Understanding this, understanding the need for transformative change, we're approaching this current round of negotiations at the Convention on Biological Diversity, so that we don't hit a point of no return when it comes to nature, in the same way that we shouldn't hit a point of no return when it comes to climate change and those tipping points. So within the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the negotiations are currently ongoing. They have been taking place for quite some time, and they are supposed to wrap up with a final framework adopted in August or September of this year in Kunming, China. Now, just to show you what the international community is doing and non-governmental organizations like NRDC, we're working with parties to try to get target language that is the best and that meets the moment and does what is necessary. But here's the challenge. I mean, this is just one, this is the habitat target for 30 by 30, what we're looking at here. And you can see everything in brackets is what is still being negotiated. And we're less than 9 months away from, concluding these negotiations, and yet some very critical elements are still under negotiation. But this is a choose your own adventure. The ingredients are there. If we pick the yellow highlighted language, for example, we will be in a very good space. So we just have to now, between now and when the negotiations are concluded, compel governments to make those right choices and to pick this particular language that's offered for them. And the way that we're doing that is working together to propose language and send it to governments. We're supporting high ambition allies that are parties to the convention, and with making sure that they have the resources and capacity to engage effectively in negotiations, so that this isn't just a global North project, but it's a project where the global South, for example, has the ability to be part of negotiating and setting the future for the whole planet. And I think I will just end there by noting that we're only going to save our planet and ourselves if we firmly break with the failed systems of the past and embark on a new journey. And part of that is this negotiation through the Convention on Biological Diversity and getting to that correct language. And we're going to be doing that by working together. And I look forward to talking more about it as we approach this Q&A. Thank you very much.
So although you won't be seeing this talk for several weeks, I wanted to record it today, the last day of March 2022. For this month marks the 1 millionth life that we in the US have lost to a disease that was in our collective power to prevent, but in our collective power only. And I'd like to get slightly political here, if I may. I'll assume that many of you are familiar with the previous administration's rhetoric in the early stages of the pandemic. So once it was clear that COVID-19 had taken root on our shores in March of 2020, our leaders started referring to the virus as our quote unquote invisible enemy. And to be sure, we weren't the only ones. Now, I've meditated on this construction for quite a while, and I think that there's a sound, if self-serving rationale behind it, this logic being that this invisible enemy would be a common enemy against whom we could lock arms and unite, against whom we could cast our leaders as wartime presidents and prime ministers who have to be kept in office to see us through this metaphorical fight. But this contrivance of a hidden enemy also suggests, if not outright declares, that we couldn't have seen this crisis coming, and as such, that it couldn't have been prevented. And I'd like to dismantle this narrative that's largely been constructed for us in light of the fact that epidemiologists, animal advocates, and others have been warning of the increasing threat that zoonoses, or these diseases that can be passed from non-human animals to human animals, have posed to us for quite some time. Now, this graphic illustrates just a few of these zoonoses with outbreaks including HIV/AIDS, which jump from chimpanzees to humans, Marburg and Ebola, which jump from bats to monkeys into humans, Nipah virus, which jump from bats to pigs into the population of farmers farming those pigs in Malaysia. And of course, COVID-19, which the great weight of evidence shows us came from horseshoe bats before, very likely passing through an intermediate animal species held in a state of suffering in a live animal market in Wuhan before spilling over into the human population. And to take a step back, if this graphic doesn't quite make the point clearly enough, this false narrative that we need to dismantle is that this is purely or exclusively a live or wet market phenomenon. Indeed, these spillover pathways also come in the form of fur and puppy mills, laboratories, domestic livestock markets, through the practices of hunting and more. And these viruses don't just randomly spill over into humans, rather our governments and corporations have approved these forms of high-risk exploitation, as well as the systemic cruelties that make them possible, and that have made it so that spillovers are no longer, these questions of if, but when. And collectively, we've become complacent. We've resigned ourselves to this prospect of not if, but when for about 100 years, and actually almost 100 years to the day that COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic. The World Organization for Animal Health, or OIE, was created in the early 1920s, specifically to stop zoonotic disease spread. And although the OIE does some laudable work in some of the formal sectors in these states, it doesn't have enforcement powers and doesn't have enforcement mechanisms and doesn't offer guidance to informal breeders or for wet markets. And so we see these diseases emerge and cross borders, this testament to the need to create a more robust international framework, one with actual, and here I mean binding obligations, which could be secured only through an international agreement. And so what would be the foundation for this new paradigm? Some of you may be familiar with the One Health concept, which affirms how our health and well-being as humans is inextricably tied to that of the environment and of animals. And if you've had a chance to read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that just came out earlier this year, you'll likely appreciate just how dire the state of our environment and the animals who inhabit it is, with this report warning of entire ecosystem collapses that will spark the emergence of numerous disease outbreaks. And so states have to advance environmental protections on the one hand, and they have to advance animal protections on the other if we have any hope whatsoever of safeguarding human health. And here, I suppose the critical question is, if states know that regulating our high-risk contact with animals and attending to just their most basic welfare needs can significantly decrease the likelihood of zoonotic disease outbreaks, well then why don't they just do it? And to be sure, they could, but they could also unilaterally regulate their use of fossil fuels and other causes of anthropogenic climate change. But states have little or no incentive to do that on their own because the effects of climate change and pollution aren't fixed to geographical or political boundary lines, meaning that even if they did go, let's just say carbon neutral, they would still be faced with the harms that are being externalized by others. And so why take the necessary steps internally if you're going to be suffering the same fate due to external forces? And so given this shared fate, we've seen world leaders speak to this need for collective action for global tasks. And in the climate change space, we've negotiated the Paris Agreement, Kyoto Protocol. So why do we need then a pandemic treaty? Well, just because, just like with pollution, the risks that are borne by one state with regard to its treatment of animals externalizes the harms upon all others. So viruses and other pathogens don't restrict themselves to geographic or political borders. As commentators observed with respect to our own government's decision to close its borders here, in light of an increasingly interconnected and globalized world, it's the equivalent of locking the door after the killer's already snuck inside. And every state has witnessed these effects, from mass border closures to the shuttering of entire industries and businesses. And so when I'm asked, why a pandemic treaty, I turn to the word itself, from the Greek pandemos, which translates quite literally to all people, this notion of a shared story. And let me say, if someone showed me some of the images of patients on ventilators, of massive pyres burning, of entire cities shut down, and all of these borders closed in normal times, I'd have said that they'd come out of a movie meant to shake us out of our complacency, which wouldn't actually be that far from the truth. Indeed, if any of you are familiar with the 2011 film Contagion, it prophetically dramatized almost this exact scenario, the transmission of a virus from bats to animals used for food, and ultimately into the human population via wet market type conditions, which here's predominant view held by the scientific community, again, as to how the coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, China. And this script has actually played out multiple times and in the same region of the world, in fact, with the SARS outbreak in Guangdong in 2002, I believe, serving as this warning sign for China, if not the larger international community. And although China responded by instituting a ban on these practices at the time, because they were under no international obligations, there were no repercussions for them when they ultimately lifted those bans upon being pressured by the industry in that state. And so let me say, not so much as an aside, that in his retrospective pandemic era interview, what Steven Soderbergh, the director of the film Contagion, observed was that the real focus of his film was about what our response would be as individuals, as states, as countries in the face of a global crisis. And along with Scott Burns, who wrote the screenplay for the film, neither could have contemplated just how inept our and honestly many governments would be in the face of such a crisis, whether that concerned holding huge political rallies or employing massive disinformation campaigns to manufacture something akin to herd immunity, all the while cultivating the very conditions necessary for new variants of the virus to breed. And I don't want to suggest, and I don't believe that all or even the majority of world leaders fall into this particular category. Indeed, those of us who are working on this project are of the view that many world leaders want to take decisive action, but that even the most empowered of them can't go it alone for the reasons that I observed earlier. It can be done through collective action, but through collective action only. And a testament to that was this clarion call issued by the World Health Organization last year to all nations. And this was March of 2021. And that open letter pointed to the pandemic as the biggest challenge that the world has faced since it was torn apart by World War II. This time when world leaders realized that they couldn't embrace this lure of isolationism any longer if they were going to secure prosperity for future generations. Prosperity that could be actualized only through mutual accountability, transparency, and cooperation, as could be provided for international agreement, as it would be a fatal mistake in the current context to treat COVID-19 as a singular occurrence. And indeed, according to the WHO, the question was no longer if this would happen again, but when it happens again. And as if underscoring the etymological root of that word, pandemic, all people, this open letter offered this haunting reminder that none of us are safe until everyone is safe. Pandemics are a collective story, one that states can't unilaterally write themselves out of. And to this end, the general director of the World Health Organization, again, along with the heads of 25 states, spoke in a single voice to say that we believe that nations should work together towards a new international treaty for pandemic preparedness and response. But what would that entail? Things like equitable access to testing, treatments, vaccines, healthcare systems, providing protective equipment, creating alert systems, data sharing, research, and the like. And to date, countries have met and proposed changes to the International Health Regulations, or IHRs, proposed along these particular lines to safeguard human health so that not if, but when the next pandemic comes, we'll not only be better prepared for it, but also be better situated to respond to it. And those efforts, my working group believes, should be encouraged, celebrated, applauded, and advanced to become international law. But when we look at this construct critically, what we see, I think, is that same built-in complacency, which I argue is invited by this particular framing that we've brought to it. For this proposition of not if, but when suggests that pandemics are just going to happen, that we have no control over their prevalence or frequency. But we can act to prevent them. And the key to this is one that the World Health Organization has already given voice to, arguing that a treaty would also need to include recognition of a One Health approach that connects the health of humans, animals, and our planet. But the question is, where would that fit? And what would it look like? And what would we call it, if not our first and best line of defense against prospective pandemics, that is pandemic prevention? So with that said, I'm going to jump into our draft convention and touch upon a few key points. Before doing so, let me observe that the CAP contemplates animal protections in a number of animal use contexts, some of which have implications for wildlife. That said, for this talk, because the panel focuses on wildlife, I'll be focusing on the wildlife exclusive ones and in the context of zoonotic disease prevention. So in its fundamental principles, the CAP begins by observing this interdependence and coexistence that we have with animals as contemplated by the One Health paradigm. And it emphasizes that the stress and the suffering that we subject animals to increases their vulnerability. And so we have there sort of our platform for why we need to protect the interests of animals. And the CAP also acknowledges that animals are sentient beings. And if adopted, this would be the first time in an international animal protection framework that animal sentience is formally acknowledged. And by acknowledging it, the CAP observes that we have this ethical obligation with respect to their treatment. So we have to promote their well-being. And that's distinct from just their welfare, which we view as concerning mostly negative affective states, with well-being pushing those boundaries to considering their positive affective states. And the hope is here that states, upon negotiating with the CAP, will change how we see or should see animals and their interests. And along those lines, the CAP encourages states and requires states to prohibit unnecessary suffering, killing, and cruelty, and doing so while taking into account cultural, religious, and other factors. So Article 3 of the CAP requires states to identify those species who are already carriers of viruses that could leap into the human population or are already reservoirs of these particular viruses and other pathogens. And from here, upon a conference of the parties, the states will come together and require that these particular species get voted upon to be included in Annex 1, which is a list, again, of these species that pose these zoonotic disease threats to human health, but also potentially animal health as well. Because again, even if a species isn't a host of a virus, a species like a cat or a dog or some farmed animals whom we're in close contact with could be an intermediate species. And from there, the CAP requires states to prohibit their capture, keeping, farming, sale, and to prevent their trade internationally. And in addition, the CAP requires states to preserve those habitats, essentially creating buffer zones between commercial developments or agricultural developments and ensuring that humans aren't coming into contact with these particular species, which again, helps those species thrive, but also protects these fragile habitats and ecosystems, which inures to the benefit of all animals. And then to regulate all live wildlife markets as well, and to ensure that animals are kept isolated with regard to species, and then also to ensure that these live animal markets are sanitary, such that new viruses are not going to be breeding there. In addition, Articles 7 and 8 focus on wildlife and habitat more generally. So in addition to calling for habitat conservation, certain criteria for killing of wildlife in general, including doing so in ways that minimize their suffering and that cause the least amount of harm to non-targeted species, and to prohibit and regulate the farming of wildlife. And here, you'll also see that the CAP requires states to prohibit the farming of fur. And this is not a far reach for many states, because now we're seeing increasingly that a number of brands are moving away from fur. So this is a sort of an easy step for most states to take. And then with respect to captive wildlife, providing the most basic species-specific care, attending to their physical and mental needs, and providing them a suitable environment. And there are a number of other contexts in which animals' interests are contemplated by the CAP. But again, I was just focusing here on the wildlife aspects. But one of the arguments that I wanted to touch upon that we've received is, well, isn't this going to create basically a low floor for animal welfare in terms of what states or how many states would actually adopt it? And that's true. But if we look at this map, those countries in gray and green are those that either have no animal protections or very few or scant animal protections. And so in order to bring these states on board, the floor necessarily has to be lowered to a level that these states can feasibly adopt the requirements for. And let me say too, that the CAP contemplates what are called protocols or sub-treaties within the treaty. And so these protocols are agreements among contracting parties to CAP, whereby one state can say, we want to protect the interests of companion animals to this particular extent, and other states can agree to do that as well. And by doing that, create sort of a sub-treaty within the treaty. And this could also include things like farmed animal welfare or additional protections for wildlife. And so again, the CAP is sort of foundational in its structure such that it creates that floor upon which all states can enter, and through protocols creates a ceiling to which all states can aspire. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for those excellent presentations. There's a question that came in. There are a few questions that came in, but I'd like to start with this one, which is quite broad, but I think also very important, and probably all three of our panelists have something to offer here. So here goes. Do you think legal advocacy is an effective mechanism for achieving meaningful improvements in the welfare of the animal kingdom, or does cultural and societal change need to happen first?
Right. I already put something in the chat here. I think that we need to use every tool. I don't think, and part of that is urgency, right? In an ideal scenario, one would build a consensus, and that there would be particular pathways, in part to ensure that whatever gains you win legally are enduring because they have a social support for them. And we see that happening in other scenarios where legal gains can be undone if they don't have sufficient social support. And even when they do have sufficient social support, they can be undone. But nonetheless, given the urgency of the situation, I don't look at these as things being mutually exclusive. I think we need to move forward on every front. And obviously we should be strategic and not waste time in particular areas that don't have a pathway to success. But it's also based upon what is your skill level? Where can you be an agent for that change? And then throw yourself into that, be it cultural, be it social, be it a legal mechanism.
Yeah, I'll just add on to Zach's excellent comments. And I think these are, not necessarily independent, but mutually, reinforcing. And so to the extent that on the international stage, we see one state or a number of states taking these issues seriously and potentially even creating trade barriers to prevent the import of lower animal welfare products from other states, that in and of itself will change the tenor of conversation in those other states. And so, mutually reinforcing. We can't necessarily wait for one to be at a particularly high level in order to start doing some of the work in the other sphere.
Yeah, great comments by the other panelists. I think the only thing I would add is, a lot of us touch on this fact when you hear what the scientific experts at the IPCC and IPBES are telling us. What they're calling for is transformative change, right? And that is something, even for us in our own lives, culturally, it's really hard to wrap our brains around that. And so in some ways that has to happen through mandates on high, at least in the timeframes that we have right now for action. And so I think that we absolutely need an all of the above approach, but I think it is going to have to be driven by legal changes and by mandates, and then, backfilled with the necessary societal and cultural changes to support that, to keep the momentum going. But we don't have time, as Zach said, for that cultural shift. We need transformative change. We needed it yesterday. The next best time to have it is today.
I think everyone's probably got something to say in response to this question. We're living in the midst of a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. Our panelists, you all, and many, many others, surely many attendants, are fighting the good fight, but the headwinds can feel discouragingly strong. What is your advice in light of that background for advocates and concerned citizens who might be feeling despondent about this state of affairs?
I think this is something that a lot of us grapple with on a daily basis, right? It's really hard to be living in this moment in time for sure. But I also think, we also have the opportunity to try to reverse both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. We don't have a lot of time to act, but we still have that opportunity. And so I think for me, that's what really fuels a lot of my work and a lot of my motivation. We really are on the cusp of disaster. And so I think it's important to wake up, to be inspired by your colleagues, by the good work that people are doing in the world, to take inspiration from that, to think creatively about ways to combat sort of these major systems we have in place that are causing these catastrophes, and then really use that to fuel the work and to fight as hard as we can, as much as we can, to try to change things.
Yeah, sure. I think I'll just echo Tanya's excellent comments. I think it was Churchill who said, never let a crisis go to waste. And insofar as we are in a crisis now that has gotten the attention of more leaders who are speaking to some of these issues, but maybe not taking us, through all of the steps necessary to avert, the crisis that is upon us. Really, seizing this opportunity to meet with legislators or meet with, organizations to echo some of the some of the arguments made in the IPCC report, for example. And even though, the IPCC report itself somewhat is all the steps that need to be taken are somewhat mitigated or pushed back by some states, for example, in the sector of animal agriculture and the like. But it is on the radar of world leaders, and this moment is that opportunity for us to sort of enlarge the conversation with stakeholders. And as disheartening as it is on a number of levels, it is also an opportunity for us as citizens or as advocates to seize this moment and to affect change.
And I get this a lot from people in the climate world, that I don't work on climate change and I'm not an expert in some of those issues, but I think I share an understanding that 3 degrees is better than 4 degrees, 2 degrees is better than 3. 400,000 species that disappear over the course, but between now and the end of the century is much better than 800,000 species disappearing. I think that it is a fight to provide future generations as many opportunities and doorways and pathways that they can build to themselves, create and continue to, fight for human existence and build a new livable planet kind of, post when we move through what we're going through now. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And I don't think that, and I don't want to presume, and there's been enough in our lives recently that would suggest that it's foolish to a certain extent to have a settled understanding of where the course of history will go. And in that context, I think that my fight is to create as many options for future generations so that they can have as many tools at their disposal to win this thing and to try to maintain humanity and as much biodiversity and wildlife on the planet as possible. And so I think that that's one angle to look at it as well.
I think we probably have time for just one more question. We've been speaking about wildlife coalitions and the need to engender collaboration and to champion each other's work as a means to better protect wildlife for the sake of animals as well as for our own. More broadly, and to dismantle silos, what other stakeholder groups should wildlife advocates be seeking to foster inroads with? What critical roles do you see such other groups playing to advance the global good for wildlife?
Yeah, I'll kick this one off. I think one of the things a lot of us, talked a lot, obviously, about the pandemic. It's on everyone's mind. And I think one of the things, for me, that really has arisen is the need to really reach out to public health organizations that are often siloed from people who do perhaps animal welfare work and do environmental work, who may not necessarily be involved in the same international advocacy that we traditionally engage in. And so the need to expand our horizons and think about those other organizations and entities. I know new organizations and coalitions and NGOs have arisen because of the pandemic, and sort of this final recognition that, yes, we are in this era of pandemics. Raj's presentation, he said, yeah, this is 100 years in the making, and we're finally maybe aware about it. But yeah, there's a lot more to do there. But I think the other thing too is a lot of faith organizations and opening our doors, because I think there is this broader recognition that these dual crises of biodiversity and climate that have led to this pandemic's era is something that more than just sort of traditional narrow advocates are concerned about. And so bringing in people with other faiths and belief systems and helping them champion these causes is also going to be key.
I would take it a little different direction than Tanya, and I would look at the frameworks. I agree with Tanya, but I would look bigger. And it's about, for me, it's like planting seeds. I don't think that we're going to come through this unless we have countervailing forces that are strong enough to extract concessions from the current systems in place. And the only place where I see that happening is a strong worker-led movement that can extract concessions from capital. Mm-hmm. And so workers aren't necessarily aligned with wildlife issues. So I think, though, that they could be. And I think that if we have a chance of success, if we are able to extract concessions from and destroy some of the systems that are compelling the loss of biodiversity and wildlife around the world, that's going to be a workers-led movement. And so I am thinking about ways in which in my own work and in others, and I think that it would behoove us all to think about how can we, in a way that is constructive, introduce some of these topics to workers and people who are at the vanguard of those movements so that when they ideally succeed, that they will be exposed to these issues, and then that they can partner with those of us who don't have power over the systems to move it forward. So it's a different take, but mutually supportive.
I echo what Tanya and Zach both said, and I'll say too, the pandemic really has given us this opportunity to call attention to the ways in which we use and exploit animals, and those groups who are exploited by the ways that we use and exploit animals, and really call attention to the fact that this is a shared story that we should be empowering all of these groups to help us write with regard to this next chapter. And I think one of the groups that I feel like has an outsized voice in this arena are veterinarians who, are usually wrapped up in protecting animal health and welfare within these particular contexts. And I think we see more broadly veterinarians and veterinary groups calling attention to whether this is sustainable. What are some of the effects on surrounding animals, whether that's wildlife or agricultural animals or companion animals ourselves. And so I'm hoping for that particular shift to take shape in the next few years.
There is, Nick, I just wanted to chime in. There's a saying, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? And I think that's something a lot of us are grappling with right now. We have these, systems in place that obviously have led us to this point in history. And, we use sort of the tools that we've traditionally had in our arsenal to combat it. But I think we also need creative thought. And I think that's where, my message for anyone in the audience is, yes, go to law school, get the traditional tools, but also keep your mind open, because we need a different system if we're going to change the system.
I think that's a great way to summarize some of the thinking that we need to promote. Maybe some of those tools are helpful, right? But we should think critically about the master's tools and say, well, wait a second, the spanner, the wrench, and the hammer, and the screwdriver, that's not enough. We need something else. We need something new. So if I haven't taken that metaphor too far, I'll just affirm all three responses there. So again, with thanks all around, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us.